Tonight's video holds 6 mysterious tales, from a story taking place deep in the woods, to stories from the afterlife. These stories will have you questioning what truly lurks out there. A huge thank you to the writers who allowed me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Growing up in the post-Soviet collapsed Latvia, I was an easily scared child. Gullible too. When I was 6, I found a book of scary stories, supposedly told by Soviet kids in summer camps, and documented by some folklorist. To me, this book was a treasure trove. It was full of what seemed like arcane knowledge, certain dark stories that I knew were made up, but deep inside I believed in them. Mind you, I don't mean I believed every word. There were details that seemed absurd to me even then, but I found ways of justifying the underlying paranormal parts by selectively ignoring the illogical mundane parts. I suppose part of my fears stemmed from the chaos that engulfed all the former Soviet republics in the 90s. My parents' uncertainty of our future lasted long enough for me to absorb it into personal anxieties. A book about supernatural horrors helped dull the fear of real ones. There were a few stories that truly terrified me, not necessarily the best stories, but those that somehow spoke to me, personally. One such story had a giant floating eye that would fly around one's summer camp at night, and kill kids who slept with their blankets not over their heads. Naturally, the hero of the story is a kid who sleeps with a blanket over his head, and through a hole in his blanket discovers the evil being, immune to his death stare, or whatnot. Through the power of the mighty blanket, the Soviet army comes the next night, shoots the eye, which escapes and is never seen again. By the way, so many of these stories ended with the rightful intervention by either the mighty Soviet army or intrepid policemen. The reason why this story terrified me was that I slept with a blanket over my head before this, but as soon as I read it, I stopped. Why? Because when I did, I kept picturing the eye floating around the room, and the only way to convince myself that it wasn't real was by sleeping without the blanket. By defying the survival strategy, I proved to myself that I had nothing to fear. Nothing but the dozen other stories that still kept me up at night. A few years later, I had mostly lost my childhood fears of the scary stories contained within the book. I knew each one of them by heart, having reread the book dozens of times, and the stories became just that, stories. My old fears were replaced by school crushes and bullies, and Sausinch. Sausinch was an old drunken homeless man in my town, shrouded in mystery and dozens of urban legends. Funny thing is, I never knew which homeless man was Sausinch. My friends and I would whisper tales of his atrocities to one another, and they would point him out to me on the streets, but it was rarely the same man. Rather than making me skeptical, this just made me more scared of the man. Who was he really? Did anyone know? I knew that he kidnapped 2 third graders a couple years back, and mutilated them in the nearby woods. That I knew. I knew that he had mutilated a kid walking near his hut in the forest, and let him bleed out on the ground. And I also knew that it didn't make any sense that everybody knew this, and he was still walking around our small town as if nothing had happened. Similarly to my blanket experience, instead of staying as far away from the woods as possible, I decided to go explore them every day I could. My town was surrounded by miles of forest from 3 sides, and even as a kid, I knew how feeble my attempts would be. Nonetheless, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, I set out on a mission to explore as much of the forest as was humanly possible, to prove to myself once and for all that I had nothing to be afraid of. Truth be told though, whenever I got to a new, unfamiliar part, I would have to try and relax, because behind every tree, within every ravine, I pictured a rugged, bearded man hiding, waiting to claim me as his next victim. June 25th, 2002 started out no different from all the other days. Right after one of the biggest holidays in our country, most adults were still recovering from their 2-day binge drinking. I decided it was a great day to go explore deeper into the woods, as it is light until very late during this time of the year. and I could leave the house early on without being questioned much. I packed my backpack full of snacks and soda and set out to an adventure. Having been doing this for over a year, the fear had finally mostly subsided. I felt like the king of the forest. For the first few mile radius, I knew every last tree, roots sticking out from the path, potential hiding holes to stash something like a knife in, and all of the other kids' forts, which there were 7 of. I wisely always walked around those and never touched anything inside, as I knew if I had been caught by the owners, I'd be sure to get beat up. I walked deeper in, crossing the only paved road through the woods into what I called the foreign woods. The road was a divider between the comfort zone and the danger zone. There was only one fort here too, made by the older 8th grader kids. This one I definitely wanted to avoid, if I wanted to come home with my backpack and my face intact. As I progressed farther in, I strayed from the path. Last time I came this way, I had followed it all the way to its end at a small river. This time I had to scour the area perpendicular to it. I didn't have a map, but I had a system. Flawed as it was, I walked for hours, well into the afternoon. I pushed through brushes and fallen trees, and then I found a tiny footpath, largely overgrown but with footprints still visible on it. I paused, truly astonished and scared, for the first time in months. The footprints were largely smeared, but you could still tell they led in both directions. I didn't know why I got scared. After all, this was still maybe only 8 to 10 kilometers from town. It wasn't crazy that some forager went out here to gather berries or whatnot. And yet, something made me tremble. Maybe the knowledge that there was no way it could be older boys that were out here, my biggest fear lately. Maybe it was the thought of running into an adult, way out here in the middle of the woods, with nobody else around. Maybe that I had no idea what I would do if that adult turned out to be Sousinch. After thinking it over for a minute, I carefully picked the direction of the footpath leading farther from the road, and slowly followed it. The path itself was being invaded by the forest, but a few larger intrusions were noticeably broken, clearing the way to some extent. I followed it for maybe 10 minutes before I finally hit a clearing. At first, I figured it to be a dead end, until I saw the fallen tree and the space before it. I had tried building enough forts to know what an entrance to one could look like. The key was to have as many natural obstacles, trees usually, in the way, so that the view is blocked just enough from anyone just passing by. I moved the branches surrounding the fallen tree, and pushed the part that had been carefully sawed, the seam covered by brush and moss. This was no 8th grader fort. I looked around me, checking and double-checking no one was near, before pulling up the cover of the dugout. The door was padlocked, but the wood had rotted so much that after a few of my 10-year-old tugs, it cracked open. A warm, damp stench escaped from the opening. I pulled out my flashlight and crawled in. When I finally made it home that day, I couldn't stop crying. If the police ever believed me, I never found out. No arrests were ever made, and nothing ever hit the news. I was never allowed to go to the woods again, and to be honest, I had no desire to. Soon after, my family and I moved to the US, and my life in the homeland became a fantastic dream, rather than a true memory of real events. No, I did not forget what happened, but somehow I pulled through, living a normal life. As an adult, a 25-year-old man, I returned to my hometown. I went back to the woods, armed with a small crowbar and a few knives, just to make myself feel a little better. Finding the spot was surprisingly easy. Memories of that day vividly came back to me as I walked through the now completely overgrown woods. I was far more scared of ticks than I had been as a child, and I knew any local would think me nuts, even risking going this far into the brush. Encephalitis and Lyme disease were far more prevalent destroyers of lives nowadays, and yet I had to know. I had to see it for myself again. When I reached what had once been a clearing, I gasped. A large hole, about 10 meters in diameter and 4 meters deep, stood where I once found a fallen down tree. Its walls were covered by moss, and little trees had made it their home years ago. I went back into town for one day, walking aimlessly for hours, before taking a cab to the airport and leaving Latvia for good. While I wandered around town, I didn't see anyone even resembling one of the many iterations of Sausage. Hell, the one homeless man I saw couldn't have been more than a year older than me. I may have even recognized him from school, not like it mattered. Like I said, no arrests have ever been made, no news ever published, because, even as a 10-year-old, deep down I understood that no homeless man who couldn't afford shoes, let alone a car, could have ever dragged over a dozen grown women to a dugout 6 miles out from town, skinned them, decorated his lair in their remains, and gotten away with it. Everyone has heard of the boogeyman, a creature, tall and dark, who comes out at night and preys on fearful children. The story is a classic tale, one that every kid and their neighbor like to scare each other with during sleepovers. People come up with several different versions of the story, like how the boogeyman only comes out during the full moon, how it can transform itself into your greatest fears, or how it lives under your bed and waits for the right moment, right when you are the most vulnerable, and snatches you. But I know the truth. There is no such thing as the boogeyman. No, there is only something far different. Something that strays from the legends. Something that you wouldn't expect. How do I know this, you might ask? It's because I saw the thing with my very eyes. I was 9 years old when it happened. I lived in a relatively quiet and peaceful home in the suburbs, with my mother and father. Being an only child, I had the privilege of having a large room filled with a vast assortment of toys and games all for myself. My parents loved to shower me with presents, and I admit, I was a bit of a spoiled kid. The more things I collected, the less storage space we were getting in my room, and eventually my parents decided that I needed somewhere to store all my junk. So a few weeks prior to when it happened, they had found an old secondhand closet and decided it would fit nicely into my room. As the 11-year-old I was, I didn't have much of an opinion on the wardrobe, and let my parents place it and clean up how they wanted. Days passed without any abnormal happening. I saw my friends from time to time, and otherwise played happily with all of my games. Days turned to weeks, and soon enough, the closet was piled with my crap. Dust and webs had collected on the tops of it. There were a couple of bite marks around the frame, and part of its edge had chipped off due to me being a little too rough while roughhousing with my friends. If it looked worn out before, it started to look its age very quickly after entering my bedroom. There was something about the closet that always felt a little off. Like, ever since I got the closet, I always had this feeling that something bad was going to happen. But again, as the kid I was, I took little to no notice of this and brushed it off quickly. The night it happened, I had been playing with my favorite stuffed toys, making them play fight with each other, which consisted mostly of me smashing them together and throwing them around the room. My playtime was interrupted by the sound of my mother entering the room and telling me it was time for bed. I reluctantly put my toys back in the closet, where I usually kept them. My mother then put me to bed and tucked me in, but not before giving me a goodnight kiss, closing the lights, exiting the room, and closing the door slowly and quietly behind her. I knew that it was time for me to sleep, but I just couldn't. I tried. I really did. But I grew relentless just laying there with too much pent-up energy to relax. I wanted to play, not sleep. Surely one quick game wouldn't hurt, I had thought to myself. I rolled over and watched the door for a few moments, until I saw the light from around the border flicking off. I sat up and instantly got to work, opening my nightlight, then pattered towards the old closet. In the dim light, the thing felt like it was towering over my little body. I never really realized how large it was until then. I felt myself shivering as I neared the piece of furniture, which I found odd because I didn't feel cold. I ignored this, and reached up to open the door of the closet as silently as I could, as to not alert my parents, and looked in. The toys in the closet were scattered messily, and it was hard to see clearly with the minimal lighting. I frowned and blindly attempted to search for my favorite toys, but to no avail. Frowning deeper, I leaned my body closer into the closet to reach into the back when suddenly I felt my body tumbling forward and right into the mess. The door behind me croaking loudly as I did so. I fumbled for a few moments to catch my footing, but found it was impossible to stand there with all the clutter around me. I scrambled forwards to try to find the walls of the closet so I could support myself, but I couldn't seem to find it, no matter how far out I reached. I stumbled over myself once more and felt my body drop. A slight panic rose in my chest as I fumbled backwards, and finally let myself push on the open closet door and tumble out. I sat there on the floor for a moment, breathing heavily while allowing myself to calm down. It took a moment, but as my eyes adjusted to the surroundings, I quickly realized that I didn't recognize where I was. I knew this because I could see the faint outlines of the walls, and compared to my large, spacey room, the place was tiny. Not only that, but I could feel something soft and woven underneath where I sat, which was a contrast from the hard, cold floors of my own room. I stood and pattered forwards cautiously, until I hit onto something large and stiff. I wasn't sure what exactly I had bumped into, but before I had the chance to reach out and touch it, I heard a quiet click noise. A light had been turned on, causing me to hiss and squint my eyes in order to adjust from the darkness to the sudden brightness that illuminated the room. After a moment of collecting myself, I opened my eyes and was finally able to see my surroundings. I was in a room of sorts. It was small and painted a light pink color, and was adorned with several... A high-pitched sound coming from behind me abruptly interrupted my thoughts, and in an instant, I froze up. There was something else here. I wasn't alone. I swallowed, turned around, and before me, at a little distance, stood the form of a being I had only heard about in night terrors. Its skin was pale, and weathered with splotches of deep red stained underneath its wide, beady eyes. Its head was abnormally round. Two oval-shaped bulges stood out from either side of its face, partially hidden by its strands of hair, but still very much visible. Perhaps the most disturbing feature on its face being the wart placed right in the center that oozed clear liquid out of one of its holes. Its physique, on the other hand, stood quite short in stature. Its body was oddly symmetrical and proportionate, bones hardly able to be seen through skin due to excess flesh and meat on the creature's body. Its slender limbs had curled in on themselves, and its paws protruded short, round claws at its tips. A fresh wave of fear consumed my being as I locked eyes with the monster, who stood as still as I was. I couldn't move an inch of my body, all motor functions freezing, as if they had lost all responses. But then, without warning, it started moving slowly towards me. It was quivering, twitching. It moved its limbs in a tentative way, one short appendage stretching itself in front of the other. It stopped, quickly and suddenly. I could see the figure's small torso breathing in and out at an irregular pace, breath coming in nothing more than a series of horrifying wheezes. My heart skipped a beat, and I shook in my spot, my own breath labored by panic. I stared into the creature's dark eyes and swallowed, thicker this time, forcing back a ball of anticipation that stuck with it. Any moment now. Any sudden movement, and this thing could jump at me, and that would be it. I shifted my eyes around the room, but there was so little space, and nowhere to run. The only exit was being blocked off by the monster. But then, something strange happened. The creature retracted slightly, and started to make noises. Croaks and cracks, and strange sounds came out from the thing's mouth. Its facial expressions morphing as it mumbled, its eyes leaking some kind of clear liquid. Was it trying to say something? Was it trying to threaten me? It had to be. There was no other fact. But its voice sounded minuscule. As frightened as I was, surely it wasn't trying to talk to me. I stared at the creature, stunned and shocked. My thought process told me that maybe I could try to communicate with it, long enough to stall it and run, until I can make it back to the safety. And so, I timidly opened my mouth and interjected the creature's incoherent sounds. Hello? And then there was silence. The creature stiffened at my words, wide eyes becoming impossibly bigger, and pink mouth dropping down into what I recognized as an expression of shock. I thought for a moment that maybe it understood me, until an ear-piercing wail erupted from the creature, which caused me to flinch backwards in alarm. The creature threw its head back, and shrieked a terrible sound that I had never heard in my life, being nothing short of purely animalistic. In my frozen state, I could see a light begin to illuminate from the small crack of the door, and a series of heavy banging sounds that came closer and closer to the room, getting louder as they did so. It was calling its sisters. Realization dawned onto me as fast as the panic rose in my chest. The only thoughts going through my head at that moment was that if I didn't get out now, surely I was going to die. I was going to die without my family ever knowing where I went, or what happened to me. The banging noises got closer, and I could faintly begin to hear the sound of the other creatures getting closer. Their voices were deeper, and less shrilling than the thing in front of me, but were equally as deadening. Adrenaline shot through me, and I suddenly regained control of my legs, and made a dash for it, clumsily avoiding striking the creature as I bolted past it, and straight to the familiarity of the wooden doors I tumbled through to arrive here. I latched onto the handle, and tore open the door with might I didn't know I contained. I hauled myself through the door, and went to slam it shut before stopping myself last second, realizing quickly that the sound would only alert the monsters of my location. I curled up and stayed as still as possible, as quiet as possible. Through the thin crack of the door, I could only see the back of the monster and not its face. The banging noise coming from its sisters ceased, but I could now clearly hear their voices, and I realized that they must have arrived, standing somewhere I could not see them. Muffled sounds and thuds were all I heard for a couple of moments, before a new figure came into my field of vision, and I felt paralyzed in a new wave of fear that overtook me. The thing was massive. It appeared to look a fully fledged version of the wailing creature, a developed version. It crouched down to hold on to the little creature, and what seemed like hoarse, soothing sounds came out of its mouth, and it appeared to work, because the little creature slowly calmed down from its hysteria. Another even deeper voice came from behind the door, where I could not see, and the little creature responded to it. Unintelligible sounds came out from its mouth, and to my horror, it stretched out its limbs to point right in my direction, right to where I was hiding. I could see the shadow of an even larger creature stepping towards my direction, and I flinched harshly, blind panic escaping me. I swallowed hard, willing the blur in my vision to disappear, but it refused. I shut my eyes and scooted backwards as far as I could, and braced myself for the worst. I kept crawling back and back, waiting for the moment the light would come in and expose my identity. Except, it never came. Instead, I felt my back hitting into several little solid items. They clacked and clattered all around me, as I pushed backwards in fearful determination to move away. Then I felt myself hitting what must be the door of the closet, and tumbled out, backflipping painfully through the clutter of toys, until I finally fell out of the dark closet. For a long moment, I simply laid there on my front, curled in an absolutely fetal position, unwilling to move. I hugged myself tightly with all my limbs to try to stop my body from shaking, but it didn't do much. Then finally, I willed one of my eyes open. I was back in my room. I was back in my room. I couldn't believe it. Nothing had changed from since when I left, save for the toys that were now scattered all around me. The closet doors were closed, and then I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. I screamed. I had no idea how long I was screaming for, but all I knew was that my voice was starting to break, and I could no longer keep back the cries of absolute anguish I had been holding in me. I was too out of it to notice the banging of my parents' footsteps making their way over to my room, or their voices calling out for me worriedly. I didn't process the lights being turned on, and only snapped out of my trance when my mother, so softly and soothingly, reached out her 3 arms to cradle me to her bony chest. "Sweetheart, what's wrong? Tell mommy what's wrong." "Closet," I rasped, and reached out an arm to point directly at the closet. Both my mother and father shot their 8 bright red eyes to each other, then to the closet, then back to me. It was my mother who spoke first. "Oh, sweetie, what's wrong with the closet?" she asked. "Monster," I mumbled out, shoving my face deeper into the comfort of her bones. I heard my mother whisper something to my father, but couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I then felt a slender, clawed hand run circles up and down my back. "Daddy's gonna have a look in the closet, okay?" My mother whispered to me in her calm voice. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell my father to stop before it was too late, but I couldn't. The words literally dying in my throat, as if something in me just physically wilted and died. I dared to peek 3 of my eyes open, blood turning cold, and watched as he opened the closet doors without a moment of hesitation and found nothing. There was nothing there except a messy pile of toys and a wooden wall behind it. My father smiled, exposing his sharp fangs in a reassuring way. See, kiddo, nothing to be worried about. But it was there. There was 3 of them, with 2 arms and legs, and it had so much hair and so much flesh. I choked out all in one breath. My mother shushed me and rocked me gently. You're really tired, honey. There's nothing there, see? Now why don't we go back to sleep? Oh, here, why don't you take Mr. Fluffy with you? Mr. Fluffy, my favorite toy, had been sprawled out on the ground right beside me, its one eye and cute toothless smile staring straight at me. My father bent over and took Mr. Fluffy into his bristly arms, and gently guided me out of my mother's arms, to heft me up into his own. He shuffled over to my bedside and placed me onto my bed, tucking me and Mr. Fluffy in, and placed a kiss on my forehead. A wave of exhaustion overcame me, and I couldn't help but stifle a yawn. I heard my mother chuckle lightly at the action, as she stood beside my father at the edge of my bed. Are you gonna be okay to sleep now, sweetie? Despite the shock I still felt all over my body, I nodded my head slowly. I was just too tired. I didn't want to play anymore. I just wanted to sleep. The last thing I heard before I let myself go to the land of dreams was my father's voice whispering, "Remember, kiddo, there's no such thing as the boogeyman." And that was something I was sure of. I blame the dogs, or more specifically, their new habit of digging a hole anytime they are left in the backyard for more than a few minutes unsupervised. I noticed the hole when I let them back inside before bed and groaned, "I'll deal with it later," I thought. It had been a long day at work, and I just didn't have it in me to fill the hole that night. The next morning, I went to the backyard to survey the damage. The hole was under the black walnut tree, and it wasn't too wide, but it was pretty deep. I was about to head inside when I saw the light reflect off something at the bottom of the hole. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and saw what looked like a piece of glass sticking out of the dirt. Curious, I reached in and started scooping the dirt around it out of the way. It didn't take long before I had moved enough of the dirt to see what it was. A glass vase. After getting the vase out of the hole, I brought it inside and carefully cleaned it off. I was surprised to see how pretty it was once the dirt was cleaned off. It was tall, cylindrical, and had hand-painted vines with tiny blue flowers running from the base to the top. At least something good came from their digging, I thought to myself. I placed it on the table at the end of the hallway and sent a picture of it to my husband while he was at work, hoping he'd get this subtle hint and bring home flowers to put in it. I was doing laundry when Muddy came home. I couldn't hear her over the sound of the dryer, so she came downstairs where I was doing the laundry to talk to me. "Alexis, did you lock my bedroom door while I was out?" she asked, mildly annoyed. "No," I responded. "Why would I do that?" Muddy looked perplexed. "Well, it's locked for some reason." I followed her down the hallway to her room. The bedroom's all locked from the inside, but we didn't have keys for them. I stopped at the bathroom across the hall and grabbed a couple of bobby pins, hoping that we could get a way to get the lock opened before breaking the door, or calling a locksmith. I got to her room and saw her jiggling the doorknob, to no avail. I told her to let me try the bobby pins before we did anything drastic. I was just about to put the bobby pin in the keyhole when the door opened. We exchanged a look, both of us clearly confused by what had just happened. She stepped inside her room and looked around. An orange blur sped by me as Crookshanks ran out of Muddy's room, clearly glad to be free. "That was weird," she said. "You did see me try to open it, right?" "I guess my lock-picking skills are better than I thought," I said, laughing. "Maybe the doorknob just got stuck or something. I've got to run some errands today. I'll stop somewhere and get you a new doorknob while I'm out. You should probably leave the door open for now until we get it replaced." As we were leaving her bedroom, she noticed the vase sitting on the table at the end of the hallway. I told her how I found it, and joked that at least the dogs were discovering buried treasure now. She chuckled and picked it up to get a closer look. "It's really pretty. I like it. You should find a better place for it though. The cats are sure to knock it down here," she warned. I noticed Oliver at the end of the hallway staring at the vase as we talked, as if he was waiting for the perfect time to sneak over and check if he could fit inside of it. I decided she was right, and made room for it on the mantel instead. The cats hadn't managed to jump up there yet, so it seemed like a safe spot. I headed out to run for my errands. When I got home, Muddy was getting ready to meet with some friends for lunch. I told her I'd have Andrew change the doorknob for her when he got home. I was looking forward to having some time to myself in the house, and I headed to the living room to relax and read a book. I had just finished a chapter where I heard one of the dogs whining at the door to be let outside. I set my book on the table, prodded Salem to get off my lap, and let them out. They bolted into the backyard, eager to burn off some energy. I grabbed a drink from the kitchen before calling them back inside. I didn't want to give them enough time to dig another hole. After bribing them with some treats, they came running back, and got comfortable on their dog beds. I settled back into the recliner and reached for my book, only to realize it wasn't on the table. I checked the floor around the table, thinking it had been accidentally knocked off by one of the cats, but it wasn't there. Maybe I left it in the kitchen, I thought. Retracing my steps, but didn't see it anywhere in the kitchen. I sighed. All I wanted to do was finish my book, and it seemed like the universe was against me. I checked under the recliner and couch. Nothing. I even picked up a sleeping Oliver to see if he was laying on it. He wasn't. But I did get a nice scratch on my arm for my efforts. At this point I was a little angry. I had just been reading it. How could it disappear? I tore the living room up looking for it, but didn't find it. Frustrated, I went in the kitchen to make myself something for lunch. I opened the cabinet to grab a plate, and found the book, sitting on top of a stack of plates. All I could do was stand there and stare at the book for a few minutes, dumbfounded. I was certain I hadn't put it in the cabinet. I couldn't even remember opening the cabinet all day. Yet the book was sitting in it. Before I could even wrap my brain around the fact that my book had apparently moved on its own, the TV turned on. I jumped, startled by the sudden noise. At first, I thought one of the animals had sat on the remote. But when I walked into the living room, I realized it was empty. It only took a quick glance around the room to spot the remote, sitting next to the vase on the mantel. I was relieved when Muddy got home a few minutes later. When I told her about the book, she laughed and made a joke about how I must have been going senile in my old age. Hearing the story out loud did make it seem possible that I had set the book there absentmindedly. So I put it out of my head and sat down to watch a movie with her. By the time Andrew got home, I had completely forgotten the afternoon's strange events. We ate dinner and made plans for Sunday since he would be off. Later that night, I let the dogs out one last time before bed. When the time came to bring them back inside, neither one would walk through the doorway. Jake just stood there with his hackles raised and his feet planted, refusing to move. Zoe was pacing behind him, tail between her legs and whining. After several minutes of attempting to bribe them with treats, I got frustrated and decided to just carry them in the door. Zoe was the easiest, so I grabbed her first and carried her into the living room. The second her feet hit the floor, she tried to bolt out the door again. Luckily, I managed to close the door before she made it back outside. Jake started barking when the door was shut, separating him from his sister. Zoe panicked and ran down the hall. Jake stopped barking when I opened the door again. He slowly slinked his way through the doorway, growling the whole time. He sniffed around the living room for a little bit before heading down the hallway in the direction Zoe had gone. After locking up, I headed to bed, only to discover that both dogs had decided to sleep in our room for the night. I gave Andrew a questioning look and he shrugged. Tired, I didn't bother to send them to their beds, and decided to just go to sleep. I slept in Sunday morning, and by the time I woke up, Andrew was already awake. He heard me get out of bed and had a cup of coffee waiting for me. I thanked him and took a sip. I noticed the dogs weren't whining to be fed, and asked him where they were. He pointed to the back door without looking up from his phone. I grabbed one of their food bowls and went to the backyard. Normally they'd see the bowl and come running, but this time, they both just stared at me from across the yard. It was too early in the morning to deal with their craziness, so I filled both their bowls and put them outside before taking a shower. Andrew changed out Muddy's doorknob while I was in the shower, so we headed out to get the rest of our to-do list done. We got back that evening and walked in the door to find Muddy cursing outside her door. It was stuck again. At least this time I don't need to try a bobby pin, I thought, as I grabbed the key the new doorknob had come with. Once again, the door opened on its own before I managed to get the key in the hole. Before anybody could figure out what to say, the bathroom door behind us slammed shut. We all exchanged looks and went to check if it too had locked, but it opened on the first try. Muddy chuckled nervously and said it must have been blown closed somehow. She wrote it off and went to bed. I didn't have it in my heart to point out the obvious to her. There was no wind. The windows were all closed and the air wasn't running, so how could the wind have blown the door closed? Andrew had to go to work super early Monday, so we decided to call tonight as well. He took a shower that night so he wouldn't have to deal with it in the morning. I was already in bed when I heard him yell from the bathroom. I ran in there and immediately saw what had caused him to shout. The mirror had fogged up during a shower, and written in the condensation was one word: mine. At first, he thought I had done it as a joke, but he could tell from my reaction that I didn't do it. We both stood there staring at the mirror, unable to explain how the word had gotten there. I went back to the bedroom, and knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Andrew came in and looked around the room. Are the dogs not sleeping with us again tonight? I couldn't get them to come inside. They wouldn't even go near the porch this time. I answered. It's nice out tonight, so I just put their beds out there rather than make them come inside when they don't want to. I kind of wish they were sleeping in here with us, he said, still unnerved by the message in the mirror. Me too, I said. Andrew fell asleep quickly, but my mind was still racing and it took me a while for me to be able to sleep. I had just drifted off when a noise from the living room woke both of us up. Andrew went to go check it out. He was only half awake and stumbled out to the living room. My heart was racing as I sat in bed, waiting for him to come back. I heard a loud crash and Andrew cursing, and I ran to the living room. I found him standing near the mantel with the TV blaring. He stopped me from walking any farther and pointed down the floor. He had knocked over the vase while getting the remote to turn off the TV. I walked over to the light switch to turn on the lights. All the noise must have woken up Muddy because she came out of her room. What is going on out here? Turn that down. She yelled over the noise. Andrew found the remote easily once the lights were on and turned off the TV. I was about to tell them both to go back to bed when the TV turned on again. This time it didn't automatically show the last channel it had been on. It was just a screen of static, completely silent. Andrew immediately pressed the power button on the remote, but nothing happened. He pressed the button harder, but the screen stayed on. Muddy started freaking out and grabbed the plug to pull it out, but a voice came through the static that stopped her dead in her tracks. The voice was angry and full of hate, even though it only said one word: mine. It spoke in an accusing tone, like we had stolen something from it. The three of us stood there frozen in our spots, too scared to move for a few minutes. Muddy was the first to speak. Please tell me that this is some messed up joke the two of you are playing on me. Her voice trembled from fear. I wanted nothing more than to tell her she was right, but all I could do was shake my head. I considered suggesting we all leave for the night, but I wasn't sure this wouldn't be waiting for us in the morning. Andrew silently moved over to her and took the power cord to the TV out of her hands. He took a deep breath and looked at me for a moment before unplugging the TV in a quick single motion. The lights in the house instantly went out, and the dog started howling at the back door. The TV screen stayed on, illuminating the room in an eerie gray light. The doors in the hallway all slammed shut loudly, one at a time, causing me to jump. I was too scared to move, but I was terrified standing alone on the opposite side of the room from my family. The cabinets in the kitchen behind me started to open and close violently. Suddenly, the whole house went quiet. The cabinets stopped slamming shut, and the dogs quit howling. The voice came through the TV again. Mine. It was louder this time, and sounded more insistent. I felt helpless. What did this entity want with us? What exactly did it think we had? Muddy's eyes lit up, and she caught my attention before motioning toward the broken vase. Suddenly it dawned on me. I looked over to the broken vase on the floor, then to Andrew and Muddy. I was too scared to say anything out loud, but I hoped they would understand what I was doing. I ran into the kitchen and started opening drawers desperately, searching for the one thing I hoped could stop this. The cat started wailing from one of the rooms, momentarily distracting me. I tried to shut out the sound of their distress as I searched. Then I found it, a tube of superglue. I looked over to show Andrew and Muddy, and couldn't help but scream when I saw a figure through the door behind them. Andrew turned first and saw it. He grabbed Muddy and hurried her over to where I was, his eyes never leaving the shadowy figure. I tried to reassemble the vase with the limited light emitted from the TV. Luckily, it didn't completely shatter when it fell. It had only broken into 5 larger pieces. I worked to match each piece where it went as quickly as possible. I heard the mirror in the front of the house shatter as I put the glue on the last piece. I closed my eyes as I held the piece on, praying it would set in time. The moment the final piece settled and the vase was reassembled, the lights turned back on. I looked to the back door and didn't see anybody. The voice from the TV spoke again. Mine. I got up slowly and looked to Andrew, still too scared to speak out loud. I nodded toward the back door. He whispered something to Muddy before stepping in front of me and leading the way. We both peeked out the door and didn't see anybody, so I quickly made my way to the hole where I found the vase. I placed the vase back in, and Andrew started pushing the dirt over it, slowly filling in the hole. Andrew and I both headed back inside. We called the dogs to go in with us, and this time they walked in without hesitation. I sighed in relief. I'd do something later to keep the vase safe in its grave under our tree, and hoped that would be enough to appease the entity that owned it. And if the dogs ever dug something up in the yard again, I'd leave it exactly where I found it. One of my patients had a severe case of depression. I'm a therapist, by the way. Sometimes my patients request to record audio of what they say happened to them, so they won't have to be questioned about them over and over again. I work in a small city in Canada. I've seen many horrid cases of assault and trauma, but this one really stuck to me. Miss Kylie Smith, age 27, unmarried, suffers from high levels of depression and schizophrenia, unmarried, under the guardianship of her father. Another thing to note is she has her mouth cut ear to ear, forming a scar, and difficulty doing basic tasks. Thankfully, she has been recovering well physically. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about her mental condition. Here I asked her what happened to her that gave her this scar, and how the monsters that follow her are connected to it. The following are her exact words written from the recordings. My sister, Maria, and I went on a camping trip a few months ago. Beautiful place, lovely service, and wonderful people. However, our country is a bit poor, so in some areas like the high mountains, there isn't much development other than small towns and cities. Even in those, it's hard to keep security up, not to mention how eerie and unsettling it is on the roads at night, with no streetlights, and the only light being the moon, stars, and passing by cars if you're lucky, a flashlight or phone. Plus, you have to watch your step or you'll fall into a river or lake. It's not pitch black, but dark enough to need a flashlight. Walk slowly, and watch your step if you don't have one. I don't know what's with my sister and I, risking our lives just to see some cool sights. Maybe it's the thrill of adventure, or the urge to promote tourism and economy in our developing home. Or maybe it's just what kids do when they're bored. Also, just saying, my sister was a beautiful person, silky short strawberry hair, tan skin, and a curvy yet slim figure, beautiful emerald eyes, and healthy pink lips. Me, on the other hand. Anyways, me and her got to our hotel room at around 10 p.m. The town was pretty populated, but our hotel was around a mile or two away from the marketplace. Again, eerie dark roads, no streetlights at all, just the distant marketplace. The two of us had our phones with us. It was a miracle we hadn't dropped them yet, and that they weren't even scratched. I left mine in the room though. The area was known to be relatively crime-free, so it was pretty safe to walk around alone. I should have went with my phone addiction and took it anyway. Mary, though, took hers. I mean, we needed some sort of light to help us walk. What are we, bats? We need to see so we don't get mugged too easy, or fall into some fast-flowing river. She decided to walk behind me with the light facing forward. One in front to lead, one in the back to light. Seems fair? I guess so. We walked a few minutes, chatting as we do, joking about how scary the road is, and that if we dropped something, especially as valuable as her phone, it'd be gone for good. I heard something fall and Maria go, "Damn it." I looked at her. I noticed a light on a rock off the road. Of course, her phone fell down near the river. Thank God the way down wasn't steep, nor long, just a few feet. She said, "You go on ahead, watch your step, I'll go grab my phone." I nodded and replied, "Okay," and carefully kept walking to the market. I walked a minute or two, or maybe longer, maybe less. It felt boring without someone to keep me company, even if it was just a few minutes. Time slowed down, but I didn't. I then stopped and turned around to look and see if Maria was there. No sign of her. I got worried and heard a splash in the river. That's where it started. Thousands of horrid thoughts filled my mind. Sister's instinct kicked in. I sprinted, ran. I flew to where she stopped, swearing and holding back tears as I did. I immediately looked down, calling her name, in my weak little shaky voice trying to keep myself together. Then I saw it, the light of her phone. I sighed in relief as she signaled me to keep on going. The light only illuminating her lower half, her denim pants, a bit of her black hoodie, a bit of her almost completely covered arms. It was cold, what can I say? We kept walking. I asked, "You good?" And she gave me a thumbs up in reply. "Okay," I said, and kept walking. The splash must have given her a scare, whatever it was. She wasn't talking much. No, at all. Just showing signs with her hands. I couldn't really see her face, or her upper half in general. I turned around to ask her why she isn't talking. That's when I saw it. Her hand, which was covered up by trying to keep it in her pocket. Her beautiful tan skin now white, pale, and her gorgeous hand, like that of a model now scrawny and skinny. I froze and gulped. But instinct kicked in as I shook in fear. We were almost at the market as my heart started to race. Only two thoughts came into my head. This isn't Maria, and run. And I did just that. I ran, in tears, into the crowded market. An elderly local man saw me in distress and walked over to me. "Hello? Is something wrong? You seem distressed." I stuttered to talk. Nothing came out but whimpers as I pointed at the road. The man's eyes went to look at her. He yelled something in their native language, which I couldn't understand. For some reason, he still had that smile on his face. At that moment, I didn't even care, as I looked up to see the light of the market shine on my sister as she walked towards me. Her face. No, its face. That fucking face. Cliché monster, and the same ones that follow me. A grin ear to ear, with white eyes, dripping with blood. A hairline so in the back you'd think it's bald. And greasy short hair. A hairstyle like my sister's, but nothing like her shiny and silky one. I heard gunshots and screeches. I couldn't tell if it was shot or not. Its voice haunts me and it forever will. That damn scream of the hell. Sounded like the devil himself got scared and screeched in fear and pain. That thing's grin. I didn't even realize I had started hyperventilating, as I felt as if I was going to faint. Locals grabbed me and pulled me into a little house of theirs. They tried calming me down. They themselves seemed oddly calm, as if this was a perfectly normal thing, or maybe even a good thing. But they were just trying to distract me, right? I kept losing my shit, sobbing and yelling, in fear, in sadness, in anger, and in disgust. So many emotions I just couldn't manage and blacked out. I woke up to what sounded like chanting. I felt a pain in my mouth. I opened my eyes to see more of those monsters, and those locals feasting on the corpse of my sister, as they carved into the sides of my mouth. It's looking at me through the window right now, tapping on the glass. You hear it, don't you? That last line gave me the chills to this day. I remember the distinct light tapping on the window right before she said it. Sometimes I wonder if my patients really are mentally ill, or if it's just something we can't see. It isn't easy, interacting with the realm of the living. If, like me, your soul becomes trapped between worlds, then all you can do is seize the moments of clarity as they come to you. So I'll start by saying sorry. I couldn't stay there, in that cold void, isolated and fixated on the moments of my passing. I hope that, in doing the terrible thing that I've done, that I can redeem myself by living again for the both of us. For as long as I obsessed over what happened, it's strange that now the memories are so vague. I died when I was 24. I believe I was hit by a car, as I can recall lying on the hard concrete, with a warm wetness covering the open wounds on my head and arms. The memories I have from the transition between existence and non-existence are curiously seamless. I followed my mother as she and my uncle carried a casket towards a hole in the earth. Next, she was at home, lying in bed with tear-filled eyes and an apathetic resolve for continuing her battle with cancer. My heart broke. I was less than a fly on the wall, watching her through the broken and hazy window that the afterlife provided. But it wasn't the afterlife. This was my afterlife. The obscure space around me, devoid of color and lacking in purpose, was my cage. There was no destinations in this place, nor was there even a ground or a sky. The scenes of my mother's life came to me in hallucination-like visions. Amidst the fog of that purgatory, my death was an obsession. When the visions faded, I doted over the scene of my mangled corpse. I wanted to fix it, to stop my own death. I knew that saving me meant saving her, but I failed. What felt like years ticked by, and I had thought of absolutely nothing aside from the pain of my mother's death, and how I could stop myself from her having crossed that street. I felt it. The day that she came, we were somehow connected. A young girl and her family had moved into my long-deceased mother's home. She was full of life and happiness, something that felt foreign to me in my state. I watched her and her mother with envy from my shadowy veil. I learned of her father's death during his tour at war, and how that hurt her mother so terribly that she had to move away from her marital home. And so, they lived with me now. I slid back occasionally to the scene of my death. The memory of that hard ground became my place of rest. The pain pulled me in like the gravity of some dying star, and I was powerless to resist the call when it came. I tried to keep to myself during the early years of their stay. From time to time, I found myself in pain as I watched them bonding on cold winter nights by the fire, or those long summers spent together on their patio, with a cold glass of tea and a book. Her mother begged her to be careful that night. It was prom, and she didn't entirely trust the boy that was escorting her daughter. I could tell, after the girl left, that her mother had wished she had her husband around to be the intimidating figure. "Love you, Mom," was the last thing she said, before following her date to a long, black limo waiting outside. It was 11:43 p.m. when the phone rang. Her mother had just started to fall asleep while waiting up in the living room. I didn't know what was being said over the phone, but I knew the look of terror and disbelief that washed over her face when it came. The familiar pain sent me reeling back to my prison. I was trapped for a time, unfeeling and lost, until she was brought home again, some several months later. My vision had returned, and I watched as a home care nurse pushed a gurney carrying the girl into the house. She didn't seem to be at all present of mind, as they wheeled her into her bedroom with a shaved head and a bandaged wound. "Thank you," her mother said to the nurse as she walked out. She had shown her some basic care and maintenance for her daughter's new day-to-day life at home. She hunched over the side of the bed, crying as she embraced her daughter for the first time since returning home. "You're home now, sweetie." The hearts I no longer owned had broken. Time went on, and she showed no sign of recovering from her state. She was home now, and required endless need for care, from feeding to bathing and using the toilet. All of this because another student got drunk and T-boned her limo while on their way home. Her mother's pain became my own. It was late, and I was battling with the call of purgatory again. It demanded my presence, and I was afraid of how much time I might lose if I were to slip away. I stood in her room, watching her breathe as her respirator pumped slowly. Her mother was asleep in a chair next to the bed, having stayed up reading to her until her eyes got too heavy. I hadn't interacted with the living world since my death. I could scarcely even recall the sense of touch, and yet I felt the need to. My grasp was weak and unfocused. I felt as if I were a baby, relearning my motor skills as I attempted to caress the blanket on her bed. After several failed attempts, I felt the fabric sliding between my fingers. I lifted the blanket below her waist slowly, elated at the simple sensation of cloth on flesh again. I took the girl's hand in my own, lifting it slightly in the air, as I felt for some sign of her presence, within the motionless shell now resting in her bed. A scream let out. Her mother accidentally kicked over the chair that she had been resting in, and backed against a wall in the room. "Leave, whatever you are, get out," she cried. She fled in terror from the room, and I panicked as well. I chased after her, feeling an immense guilt as she tumbled down the hallway, ducking as I inadvertently tossed picture frames and shifted furniture with my aura. I wanted to explain myself. I needed her to know that I had been there all along, watching and hoping, just as she had. But again, I failed. I could only listen as she made plans to leave my home the following day. She was scared, and her brother offered to help her out. I felt even worse, knowing that when I touched the girl's hand, I felt no sign of her consciousness within. Her mother began packing their belongings, preparing to leave me behind. The poor woman lost both her husband and only daughter. Now she was scared out of her mind and didn't feel safe in her own home. She, like I, was alone. I had to stop her from leaving. She was the only thing left keeping me from my eternal prison in purgatory, and I couldn't let her story end as darkly as my own, so I made that terrible decision. The light was harsh on my eyes. My body felt extremely warm, a sensation you don't pay as much attention to when you've been alive for more than an hour. There was a big hubbub going on around me as I continued to struggle with opening my eyes. A pressure became more noticeable deep in my throat until it slowly slid out and I choked on fresh oxygen once again. My baby girl. Her mother came into view in front of me. I rubbed my eyes to regain my focus and saw her, clutching one of my hands tightly, tears falling down her smiling cheeks. I can't tell her the truth about who I am. She deserves to be happy, and I'm privileged to be here for her now. I know everything that they went through during the many years they spent in my home, and I'm doing my best to honor her memory by loving her mother as my own. I don't know that I made the right choice, but I did what felt right to me. She's been so happy ever since I woke up, and I can't help but feel as if my mother and her daughter are smiling down at us, happy that we have each other, regardless of the circumstances. Let me explain my situation. I am currently boarded up in an attic in a small East Coast town following a very important event. It was a simple drive that brought me to the small town of Cape Noask in Maine. Google Maps decided my route wasn't scenic enough and sent me off into the woods until around midday. That would be great and all, but despite having a nearly full tank before my arrival, I suddenly stopped just outside of town. No fuel, battery dead, and no radio connection. Cape Noask was a small town, and I quickly went to find a mechanic. This was fairly easy, thanks to the kind folks in the town. At least I thought so at the time. Time of which I had little of, as it seems the sun moves quicker in this town than the area around it. After arriving at about 1:08 p.m., I reached the mechanic at about 1:35 p.m. However, with the sun's position, I would have guessed closer to 5. The mechanic himself looked to be around 55 give or take a year, wearing blue coveralls and generic olive-colored snapback. Quite standard, really. He seemed rather bored sitting outside the shop on a pile of tires, and reading through what looked to be a magazine dedicated solely to mirrors, and as weird as that sounds, he seemed to be quite interested at its pages. "Morning, son. You from around these parts?" The mechanic called out to me. "No, from Maryland." Car broke down about 1/5 of a mile back up the road, out of gas and power. I called back to him. "Well, come on then, let's have ourselves a look." He called back, abandoning his position by the shop and grabbing a nearby gas can. We walked back to the car, and he got to work examining what's wrong with it. Within several seconds, he determined that he did not know how to fix the car. He did, however, mention a nice restaurant back towards the center of town that I should check out while he gets the car back to the shop to fix it up proper. Now, how exactly he planned to get it back, I didn't know, and I didn't think to inquire him about it at the time. Time really must have moved faster in the town itself. By the time I walked the short distance to town, I could hardly see the sun over the trees by that point. Though my watch and phone both agreed that it could only have been around 4 p.m., which at this time of the year wouldn't be sundown, or even close. Something was wrong with this town, very clearly wrong, as by the time I reached the town center, most of the populace was heading into the streets, and by most, I mean presumably all. Now what made this particularly strange was the fact that each upon leaving their former dwellings gathered along the street side lied down in perfect fashion and stared directly up. The last of the sun had died over the trees, and here I was, a stranger in a small town with the entire populace laying on the ground. Quite weird, and that's when I heard the first shriek. It sounded primal, of anger and curiosity mixed, and not particularly human. I started running then, and it was around the next corner that I ducked into the house and found a peculiar note. The note read as follows: "I've determined the cause of this behavior. It must be the moon. The last thing I remember each night before I lose consciousness is the moon, and the light shining down through the windows. There is something wrong with it. I looked at it again tonight, but I remained conscious, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt fear of something wrong with it. I must leave here before the others see it." I heard a sudden banging on the door, and saw the moonlight seep through the windows. I put my very life into the author of that note, and ran to the attic, and hid only to see a major window on the front wall, and the back wall, and a mirror facing the only alcove that one could hide in. I quickly ducked behind the walls of the alcove, and moved away from the eastern window towards the western window. It was there I saw the mechanic's shop and my car, doused in gasoline, and soon alive with fire, trapping me inside the town for the near future, unless I want to chance whatever it is in those woods. I took my phone and got a quick photo of the moon, in hopes to see for myself what was wrong with it. And as I looked at the photo I can't remember much of the following minutes. I completely lost consciousness, and awoke a minute later about to climb down from the attic, and into the lower house. I stopped myself, and for good measure, found some rather strong boards to throw on the door, locking myself in this dank and almost completely dark room. Nearly complete except for the moonlight still covering the direct path from the east window, through the entire room, but not the alcove. I ducked in there, and had a good look at myself in the mirror, as the moon rose behind me. And that's how I got here. The town is completely silent, and my best hope is to wait until morning, to see if I can find some answers, and perhaps to see what is going on. Oh, and don't forget to take a look at the moon for me tonight.